Happy Thanksgiving, America. I'm Donna, and I'm here with my friends to tell you the real history behind this holiday. Growing up, I knew that what they told you in school about Thanksgiving wasn't true. That's not the true story. The true story behind Thanksgiving was, after every killing of a whole village, these European settlers celebrated it, and they called it Thanksgiving. But it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln became president that it became an official holiday. He ordered 38 Dakota men to be hung for war crimes
after the sacred holiday Christmas.
We take this time to remember our elders who lost their lives due to what really happened. Usually my mom makes a Native American dish for us and we pray.
Growing up, I would be kind of annoyed that they didn't know what actually happened on Thanksgiving and that they're actually celebrating the deaths of many people and many tribes that were lost.
Whether it's to give thanks or to be with your family, you should learn how the holiday was established in the first place.
I'm thankful for being born indigenous to this continent.
I'm thankful that I still have my culture.
I'm thankful that my elders kept our culture alive all these years.
I'm thankful to be indigenous, resilient, and alive.
I'm thankful for us all to be able to stand together, stand strong, and stand as one. Happy Thanksgiving, America.
Did Abraham Lincoln order the execution of 38 Dakota fighters? After a violent Native American uprising in 1862, President Lincoln signed off on 39 executions. The traumatic true history and name list of the Dakota 38. The Dakota 38 execution was the largest mass execution in the United States and took place on December 26, 1862. On this day after Christmas in 1862, 38 Dakota men were hanged under order of President Abraham Lincoln. The hangings and convictions of the Dakota 38 resulted from the aftermath of the U.S. Dakota War of 1862 in southwest Minnesota. In addition to the 38 men hanged the day after Christmas, there were terrible injustices committed against 265 others in the form of military convictions and inhuman injustices to more than 3,000 Dakota people who were held captive, then forced to march west out of Minnesota. December 26, 1862. And like the young lady said in the video, that's where they deem their Christmas. Alright, so their Christmas and their Thanksgiving holidays come from massacre of the Native American people, which are Israelites.
Horrors of Thanksgiving and America as a white future minority coming up.
Far and away the most massive genocide in the history of the world. The lowest life expectancy in the West. And the year the U.S. will turn native.
Virtually none of Thanksgiving has an ounce of accuracy, notes the bestseller Lies My Teacher Told Me. The idea of Europe bringing civilization to the Americas simply flips truth on its head. This is what European explorers actually found in North America.
Far and away the most beautiful city on earth. 5 times the size of London or Rome. Great towers and buildings rising from the water. 60,000 gleaming houses, and how spacious and how well built they were. Of beautiful stonework and cedar wood, and the wood of other sweet-scented trees. The many streets and boulevards of the city were so neat and well swept, despite the multitude of inhabitants, crisscrossed with a complex network of canals, like an enormous Venice, but also remarkable floating gardens that reminded of nowhere else on Earth.
While Europe was drinking water from its polluted city rivers, huge aqueducts transported America's water from fresh springs.
But what impressed most were the special merchant areas, where timber and tiles and other building materials were bought and sold, as well as greengrocer streets, where one could buy every sort of vegetable, fruits, honeys, nut paste and chocolates. Astonished by the personal cleanliness and hygiene of the colourfully dressed populace, and by their extravagant use of soaps, deodorants, and breath sweeteners.
Most Europeans never bathed and kept clothes on at all times. The Pilgrim's notes biographer Zini Feiner had a terrible smell. Indians tried, quote, without success to teach them to bathe. Settlers also had bad breath from rotting teeth. Death and starvation was so common that corpses were just dumped in open pits known as poreholes. Many turned to alcohol and committed suicide. In fact, the story of the first settlers has been deliberately changed, notes author James Lowen, because the truth's so shameful. They actually settled hundreds of miles further south and stayed in America because the mission was a failure. Their real aim, reports historian Robert Beverly, was to find some gold and take it back to Europe.
They spent their days digging random holes in the ground, aimlessly looking for gold instead of planting crops. Soon they were starving and digging up putrid Indian corpses to eat. They took some Indian prisoners and forced them to teach the colonists how to farm.
And the meal with the natives wasn't quite the Thanksgiving shown on TV and in schoolbooks.
The colonists offered the Indians a toast to eternal friendship, whereupon the chief, his family, advisors, and 200 followers dropped dead of poison.
In mainstream history books, perhaps the most common description of American territory then is virgin land. In fact, notes historian Peter Jennings, it was widowed, horrific enough the Nazi ethnic cleansings in Europe during World War II. Leading American studies professor David Stannard notes it's dwarfed by, quote, far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. The death of 100 million indigenous people in the, quote, American Holocaust.
Virgin Land, Henry Nash Smith. The spell that the West has always exercised on American people had its most intense impact on American literature and thought during the 19th century. All right. In this book, he discusses how he poisoned the Indians and the death of the Indians in the American Holocaust. Lies My Teacher Told Me. Everything your American history textbook got wrong. 1995 book by James W. Lowen. A sociologist, it critically examines 12 popular American high school history textbooks and concludes that the textbook authors propagate false, Eurocentric, and mythologicalized views of American history. So basically lies and Eurocentric thinking. Etymology dictionary online. Eurocentric is an adjective. Euro plus centric. Alright. Euro. Word forming element meaning Europe, European, from combining form of Europe. centric. Word forming element meaning having a center or a certain kind, centered on, from Latinized form of Greek, pertaining to a center. All right? So they form their Eurocentric thinking and lies, and that's what they teach us in school.
But also vast numbers from a deliberate policy aimed at wiping out the race that mainstream history books continue to pretend never happened. He knows when Heinrich Himmler called the final solution, quote, delousing, Himmler was only echoing the Pilgrim Army's rallying cry, nits make lice, nits being Indian babies. This was a map of Indian nations across the US. 80% of the first government's entire budget went on attacking existing Indian settlements to take their developed farmland. Settlers would most probably not have survived, writes Jennings, on their own. 95% of America's entire population was then wiped out. American Holocaust notes there is documented evidence of colonist leaders going town after town, deliberately killing all men, women and children. Yet school texts and history books remain silent. Orders came from the very top. Under the direct order of George Washington, at least 28 of 30 Seneca towns and all the towns of the Mohawk, Onondaga and Cayuga were simply obliterated. George Washington wrote, the Indian country, quote, must be destroyed. Thomas Jefferson called to, quote, pursue Indians to extermination. Nobel Peace Prize winner Theodore Roosevelt called beneficial the eradication of the native race. Senate notes genocide was official public policy. California Governor Peter Burnett in his 1851 message to the legislature.
Extermination must continue to be waged until the Indian becomes extinct.
Another governor issued the public proclamation to, quote, pursue, kill and destroy all Indians. A witness notes the ensuing bloodbaths practically wiped out the native race.
The whites shoot them down like wolves, men, women and children, wherever they could find them. This war of extermination against the Aborigines is tending to the final extinction of the race.
What reportedly saved the race from extinction was their use as slave labor.
This extermination policy has proved so injurious to the interests of the whites.
All right. To the whites.
Children in the United States learned that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. But since there were already millions of people living on the American continents when he arrived, what is Columbus's real importance in history? This video will show what really happened during his voyages between two worlds and how they helped shape the world we know today.
He didn't find the Americas. He found the original Americans, the Israelites, the original Americans.
1451, Columbus was born in the Republic of Genoa. There he began his sailing career, but in 1477 he was hired as a merchant mariner for King John II of Portugal. Portugal was gaining power on the seas, colonizing Atlantic islands and establishing trade with African kingdoms. By the 1480s, they found out the Indian Ocean was on the other side of Africa. This discovery gave them a fast and cheap trade route to the rich goods of Asia. During Portugal's rise in power, a group of European scholars thought the Earth was smaller than what was previously believed. This meant one could reach Asia by sailing west. Because of the newly invented printing press, Columbus read about these recent theories and was enthralled with the idea of sailing west for riches. He tried to get funding for an expedition from Portugal, but King John didn't believe in the small Earth theory. He then tried in France, England, and Spain with no luck until 1492 when the Spanish sovereigns, Ferdinand and Isabella, decided to help fund 3 ships for a voyage. They saw Columbus as a means to compete against Portugal's success. The Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria set sail on August 3, 1492. After a stop on Gran Canaria, the rest of the trip took 5 weeks. On October 12th, land was spotted. It was an island, and at dawn Columbus went ashore. Because he believed in the small Earth theory, Columbus thought he was near Japan. He called the natives of this island Indians because India was what many Europeans called Asia at the time, but the natives were really called the Taino. Trade began between the two parties, but it was clear that the Taino did not possess the fabled riches of East Asia. However, some of them wore gold as jewelry. Columbus was hungry for gold to bring back to Spain. He wandered around searching for a large amount of gold until the Santa Maria crashed into a reef on Hispaniola. Columbus left 39 men at the site to build a colony. He promised he would return for them and sailed back to Spain. When he arrived in Europe, Columbus was famous. He had sailed into the unknown and returned to tell the tale. He brought back many things to show the Spanish king and queen, including Tainos he had kidnapped. But he did not bring enough gold, so Ferdinand and Isabella equipped Columbus with 17 ships for his second voyage, and named him governor of all the lands he discovered. Columbus was an excellent sailor. He found his way back to Hispaniola using his own keen navigation skills, and kept the coordinates of his route a secret. When the fleet arrived at Hispaniola, they found out that the 39 men who were left there to build a colony had been killed by a local chief. They also found out the same chief had lots of gold on his land. Columbus led a crew into his territory and found a gold quarry. The chief was angered by the arrogance of these invaders, and soon fighting broke out. To intimidate the chief, Columbus captured 3 of his captains and beheaded them in public. This enraged the Tainos and disturbed many of the Spanish. To make things worse, there was soon no gold left to mine. Columbus sent letters back to Spain on a ship and exaggerated the amount of gold that was found. To produce more profit for the king and queen, Columbus suggested starting a slave trade. Without waiting for a response, he seized over 500 natives and sent them to Spain. Most of the remaining natives fought against this injustice, so Columbus unleashed terror on them. Once defeated, they were forced to pay tributes of gold to the Spanish. It was worse than slavery. People who didn't find enough were punished brutally. Forced to constantly look for gold, the Taino could not farm their lands anymore. Many escaped into the hills, only to be hunted down. During the first few years of the tribute system, 50,000 natives died. Columbus's brutal command made him enemies in the colony as well as in Europe. In 1496, he sailed for Spain to defend his actions to Ferdinand and Isabella. He left his brother Bartolomeo in charge of the colony until he returned. The king and queen listened to his defense and allowed him to return to Hispaniola in 1498. By now, the colony was a disaster. Bartolomeo was just as bad at governing as his brother was, if not worse. A rebellion had begun among the Spanish, and soon the king and queen sent a royal investigator to assess the situation. He put the Columbus brothers on trial. They were found guilty of numerous crimes against both the Spanish and the natives. The brothers were arrested and sent back to Spain. Christopher Columbus was no longer in charge of the New World. Now old and humble, he was allowed one last voyage across the ocean, but he was not permitted to return to Hispaniola. He explored the Caribbean for 2 years before sailing back to Spain, where he died in 1506. We have learned that Columbus was ambitious, intelligent, and courageous, but he was no hero. His exploits in the colony were disasters for the native inhabitants, and their way of life was destroyed by his actions as governor.
Every year in November, a story is taught to America's school children. It goes like this. After a harsh winter, the Pilgrims, with the help of a native named Squanto, reaped a successful harvest and celebrated by inviting the local Indians for a friendly feast and started a yearly tradition. Yay! Almost every part of this story is historically inaccurate, and it's time to clear up the myths and lies surrounding the story of Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims were an English sect of the Puritans, the separatist Protestant congregation. These Puritans didn't call themselves Pilgrims, didn't come seeking religious freedom, and didn't wear buckle hats. By the time of the Pilgrims' arrival in 1620, 2/3 of Massachusetts' indigenous tribes had already been killed by new diseases brought by British explorers or kidnapped into the European slave trade. Plymouth Rock lay in the center of the territory of the recently extinct Pawtuxet tribe, which had been wiped out by a plague. Upon landfall, one of the first things the Pilgrims did was to rob the graves of the Wampanoag tribe and steal as much of the tribe's winter provisions as they could get their hands on. This caused tension between the Wampanoag, who ruled over Massachusetts, and the Puritans, which continued to increase until 1621 when Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoags, found it politically advantageous to form an uneasy truce heavily slanted in the Europeans' favor. For the Wampanoags, the alliance was a necessity which allowed them to focus on fighting off other tribes invading their territory. Squantum, or his real name, Tisquantum, was a member of the Pawtuxet tribe whose territory the Pilgrims had colonized. Captured by British slavers 6 years before the arrival of the Pilgrims, he was sold into slavery in Spain, escaped to England, then returned to North America where he worked with British merchants seeking to exploit Newfoundland. He eventually returned to New England to find his entire tribe dead and the Pilgrims living in what had been his tribe's summer village. Tisquantum would become the key for survival of the Puritans as he showed them how to plant and fertilize corn and other native vegetables, where to fish, and how to communicate with natives. The Feast of 1621, which we think of as the first Thanksgiving, was not an annual dinner, but rather a celebration of a successful harvest after a harsh winter. A letter written by one of the 50 Puritans at the dinner, Edward Winslow, recounts that they survived this winter because of the Wampanoags, but didn't see them as equals and didn't invite the natives to the feast. During the celebration, the Puritans fired off muskets and cannons for sport, which put the Wampanoags on full alert. 90 armed natives marched to Plymouth to see what was happening, and they stayed to make sure the British weren't planning anything violent. The eventual feast was not one of thanks and respect, but one of distrust and aggressive action. Another, quote, Thanksgiving would only come 16 years later when the Puritans were celebrating their recent massacre of the Pequot tribe. Yay! Even this wasn't what we think of as Thanksgiving today, but instead a day-long Puritan fast in remembrance of God. The holiday and concept we know as Thanksgiving started in George Washington's 1789 Thanksgiving Proclamation, where the Puritans aren't even mentioned. The holiday wasn't celebrated nationwide until 1863, when Lincoln declared it a national holiday to try to keep the country united. Even the myth about the Indians and the Pilgrims didn't even come about until the 1900s, yet still this story is taught as fact in schools across the country. So, this holiday season, forget about this made-up story of kindly Indians and grateful, friendly Pilgrims, and instead honor the natives of then and now with Native American Heritage Day.
The first Thanksgiving. American schools generally teach a conventional story about the meeting of Pilgrims and Indians that finished with an amazing dinner. The end. But there's more to the tale. This video will explain the events around the first Thanksgiving and how it's not the image ingrained in tradition. At the start of the 17th century, southern New England was home to a variety of busy communities within several confederations. These were the people of the First Light, and they called their home the Dawnland. Political leaders were known as sachems and had been trading with Europeans for over 100 years before the Pilgrims. Relations soured only after deceitful Europeans kidnapped locals to sell as slaves. Permanent European settlement was impossible due to the already high population of native occupants. But in 1616, tradesmen introduced a disease to the Dawnland, whose inhabitants died in droves from a lack of immunity. In 3 years, up to 90% were wiped out in several confederations, including the Wampanoag.
American Holocaust by David E. Stannard. Chapter 3. The Spain that Christopher Columbus and his crews left behind just before dawn on August 3rd, 1492, as they sailed forth from Palos and out to the Atlantic, was for most of its people a land of violence, squalor, treachery, and intolerance. In this respect, Spain was no different from the rest of Europe. Epidemic outbreaks of plague and smallpox, along with routine attacks of measles, influenza, diphtheria, typhus, typhoid fever, and more frequently, swept European cities and towns, clean of 10 to 20% of their populations at a single stroke. As late as the mid-17th century, more than 80,000 Londoners, 1 out of every 6 residents in the city, died from plague in a matter of months. And again, as with its companion diseases, the pestilence they called the Black Death returned.
The American era of limited diseases ended with the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. European diseases and epidemics, while still present among Native American populations today, were especially influential in Native American life of the past. Diseases and epidemics can be chronicled from centuries ago when European settlers brought forth diseases that devastated entire tribes. European settlers brought forth diseases that devastated entire tribes. Deuteronomy 28 and 61. Also, every sickness and every plague which is not written in the book of this law, them will the Lord bring upon thee until thou be destroyed. Deuteronomy 29 and 22. So that the generation to come of your children that shall rise up after you, and the stranger that shall come from a far land, shall say, when they see the plagues of that land and the sickness which the Lord hath laid upon it. Stranger that shall come from a far land. European settlers brought forth diseases that devastated entire tribes. Siege of Fort Pitt took place during July 1763. This event is best known as an early instance of biological warfare, which the British gave items from a smallpox infirmary as gifts to Native American emissaries, with the hope of spreading the deadly disease to nearby tribes. Biological warfare. Also known as germ warfare, is the use of biological toxins or infectious agents such as bacteria, viruses, fungi, with the intent to kill or incapacitate humans, animals, or plants as an act of war. Just connecting the dots for you, family. So that's what Thanksgiving. This is what we thinking. This is what really was going on. Biological warfare, smallpox blankets. All right. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Battle of Fort Pitt. The Siege of Fort Pitt. July 1763. And it's one of the curses in Deuteronomy, as you can see, that the Lord intended for us to receive. So, just connecting the dots, putting real history together for you. All right. With that, I'm gonna say shalom, and let's not be involved in these devil days anymore. Okay, these occult ritual days. Shalom, fam.